Hey everybody, thanks for joining me for this episode of ATP Ask the Pastor. I'm Pastor Joshua Sullivan at Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Kerrville, Texas. Today somebody writes, Dear Pastor, what are possible offices in the church? And how do they relate to the divinely established office of the church, the pastoral office? Could there be offices such as lectors, that is readers, who read the divine services without the Lord's Supper in the absence of a pastor? They would only exercise a part of the functions of the pastor in that case. All right, so I think since we're looking at this, we want to look at what the office of the ministry is and does. And we also want to look at how the church has historically dealt with this. And I think that this will give us a good answer. So there's one divinely instituted office within the church, and that's the office of the ministry, the pastoral office. Christ established that office with the 12 apostles and the sending of the 70. And the office of the ministry has the responsibility to teach the gospel and administer the sacraments. Now, in Christian freedom, so by human right, the church from a very early time established grades within that ministry for the sake of ordering the church. And so in the era after the apostles, the man-made grades of bishop, presbyter, and deacon were firmly established. And over the course of the time then, over the course of the church's history, she established other grades, again, within the ministry that came to be known as minor orders. And these were porter, lector, which is Latin for reader, exorcist, and acolyte. And those grades within the ministry had specific functions, but they were still grades within the office of the ministry. And this is because the early church understood that if the functions of the office are being exercised, then you better have the office to do those functions. Now, specifically talking about lectors, readers, this is something that's quite ancient in the church as well. The earliest reference to someone reading the scriptures who wasn't the preacher comes from Justin Martyr, writing in his first apology, probably around 150, 155 AD. He says, On the day called Sunday, all who live in cities or in the country gather together to one place. And the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read as long as time permits. Then, when the reader has ceased, the president or leader verbally instructs and exhorts to the imitation of these good things. Now, that this reader had a specific office is clear from Tertullian of Carthage, who writes about a half a century later. He describes how heretical groups promoted just about anybody to the clergy, and that it was a very fluid thing. He wrote, Nowhere is promotion easier than in the camp of the rebels, where the mere fact of being there is a foremost service. And so it comes to pass that today one man is their bishop, tomorrow another. Today he is a deacon, who tomorrow is a reader. Today he is a presbyter, who tomorrow is a layman. For even on laymen do they impose the functions of the priesthood. So for Tertullian, or from Tertullian, we see that the reader was a specific rank among the clergy in the mid to late 2nd century, just as we saw in Justin Martyr. Now, the grade of reader came to be known eventually as one of the minor orders that were typically given to men at the beginning of their interest in the ministry. So Scripture assigns the public reading of itself, of Scripture, to the pastoral office. St. Paul says to Timothy in 1 Timothy 4:13, give attention to reading, to exhortation, and to doctrine. And that reading that Paul tells Timothy to pay attention to and to devote himself to isn't private study, and it's not devotional reading, but it's anagosis in Greek, which is public reading. And this is reflected then in the early church's use of readers or lectors as a grade within the ministry, especially for those who are pursuing the ministry or interested in the ministry. Now, although the office of reader existed from, at least in the 2nd century, it was Siricius of Rome. He was bishop of Rome from 384 to 399 AD. It seems to be he who first put all this together and codified a particular order for advancement up through the ranks, through the grades of the office of the ministry. He writes in a letter to a certain Hymerius, whoever then vows himself to the service of the church from his infancy should be baptized before the years of puberty and given a share in the ministry of readers. If he lives honorably from the period of adolescence to his 30th year and is content with one wife, whom he receives as a virgin, through the priest, with a general benediction, he should be made an acolyte and a subdeacon. If thereafter he maintains the level of his previous continence, he should receive the rank of deacon. If then he performs the ministry commendably for more than 5 years, he should appropriately be granted the priesthood, the presbyterium. Finally, after 10 more years, he may rise to the episcopal chair if through all this time he is approved for uprightness of life and faith. Now that's for someone who is from infancy, he says, kind of on the track to become minister. In the very same letter, Siricius outlines the process for an adult convert who seeks clerical office. He writes, "He who is already of adult years, when his change to a better mind prompts him to leave the laity for the sacred army, shall attain the fruit of his desire only upon condition that immediately after his baptism he join the band of readers or exorcists, provided also that he has been known to have had or to have but one wife and to have taken her as a virgin. When such a man has been initiated and has served for 2 years, he shall for the next 5 years be an acolyte and subdeacon and thus be promoted to the diaconate if during this period he is judged worthy." So that's the history of the church, then, how they view the grade of reader within the office of the ministry as part of the stepping stone towards clerical office, then, because it itself is part of the clerical office, so to speak. Now, after the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965, the Roman Church suppressed these minor orders and renamed them ministries, which could be assigned to the laity. And so in the Roman Church today, a lay reader is basically a lay minister in other denominations. A lay minister will read the scripture lessons, except for the gospel. He'll also recite the psalm between the readings if there's no psalmist, and if there's no deacon present, then he has other responsibilities during the service. And so this is just one example how Rome has laicized what's historically been part of the office of the ministry. Now, many Lutherans, they followed Vatican II's lead and separated the public reading of Scripture from the office of the ministry, and in doing so, they've blurred the small catechism's distinction between pastors and hearers. So what have the Lutherans historically done then? Well, Lutherans confess in the 14th article of the Augsburg Confession that no one should publicly teach in the church or administer the sacraments unless he be regularly called, and that publicly teaching includes leading the service, since that is the public ministry of the church. In fact, in the late 16th century, Lutheran churches had Kirchners or Küsters, which was sometimes translated as sexton, but probably better translated in English as clerk. 1557 Saxon articles, they allowed the Kirchner to read the epistle and gospel lesson of the day and sing German hymns in the pastor's absence. So pastor's ill, then the Kirchner would read the epistle gospel and lead some singing. A 1581 church order from Hoya, Germany, enumerates, there's the word, the clerk's responsibility, and most of those responsibilities align with those of the lay elder in American Lutheranism today. They also led congregational singing. Now, my favorite duty of the clerk at the Hoya church order is to drive from the church dogs that run around during services and bite each other. I just think that's a fun duty. The ninth responsibility in the church order at Hoya states, when the pastor is ill and no substitute can be obtained, to read to the people the 5 chief parts of the catechism with Luther's explanation and to examine the children in the catechism. So in spite of all the different responsibilities that were laid upon the clerk in the Lutheran churches, leading the divine service in the absence of the pastor was not one of them, nor was reading a sermon or a letter from the pastor one of those responsibilities. So both church orders show how 2 churches in the Reformation era practiced their confession that only those who are called and ordained should be leading the public services of the church. So what does this mean for the question then? Could we have lectors or readers in the church today that read the entire service but don't celebrate the sacrament of the altar, don't have the Lord's Supper? And I think the early church's rule here, I think this is helpful. If the functions assigned to the office of the ministry are being exercised, then you need to have the office. If the church thought such lay readers were helpful, then she would have them. But I think in keeping with the history of the church, with our confession of faith, readers should be considered a grade within the office of the ministry. And if the reader were to be called and ordained into the ministry, then there's no reason why he couldn't celebrate the sacrament of the Lord's body and blood, because at that point he would be a minister then. So I hope this helps answer the question. Reading belongs to the pastoral office, historically and both scripturally. We'll see you next time for another episode of ATP.